What's art and what's literature? We'll think about these questions while studying formalism and new criticism today. Let's go ahead. Hello, everyone. Today, I will start with talking briefly about what formalism is about. Please listen to the recordings very carefully and take notes. When you study an artwork, you can approach it in many different ways. If you look at the sculpture I made, you can approach it in two different ways. For instance, you may say, what you see is my overflow of feelings, my anger, my love, my hunger. It is nothing but my feelings. Okay, so here you see that my approach to that sculpture is totally subjective and personal, and it is about feelings. So in that sense, I do not really focus on the sculpture itself, but the feelings it created in me. Another position could be exemplified as follows. What you see is the juxtaposition of the curves resting in the curly hair of the woman, contrasting the smooth skin of hers. So as you can see here, I look at the form of the sculpture. I look at the shapes, the twists, and the texture of the sculpture itself. So today, as we will be talking about formalism and new criticism, you will see that we will follow this second approach to uh, artwork or literary work. That is to say, we will look at the form of the literary text. In the following two slides, you will hear two lectures, mini lectures on formalism. I want you to listen to me very carefully and take down some notes to understand what formalism is all about. After you listen to the material and take notes, you will have a quiz. Answer those questions right away. In literary criticism, formalism refers to a style of inquiry that focuses almost exclusively on features of the literary text itself, to the exclusion of biographical, historical, or intellectual contexts. The name formalism derives from one of the central tenets of formalist thought, that the form of a work of literature is inherently a part of its content, and that the attempt to separate the two is fallacious. By focusing on literary form and excluding superfluous contexts, formalists believed that it would be possible to trace the evolution and development of literary forms and thus literature itself. In a nutshell, formalists believed that the focus of literary studies or any research study or examination of a literary text should be the text itself and not the author's life or his social class or his period in which he lived. Art is produced according to certain sets of rules and with its own internal logic. That is to say, an artwork, a literary work, is nothing but an artwork or a literary work itself. New forms of art represent a break with past forms and an introduction of new rules and logic. The goal of the critic or the researcher is to examine this future of art, that is to say, the form. In the case of literature, the object of reflection is the text's literariness, that which makes it a work of art and not a piece of journalism. This specific attention to the details of the literary text was an attempt on the part of literature to turn its discipline into a science. Formalist literary criticism is important because it is one of the first attempts to pull literary studies or literature itself to scientific endeavor, to science. So it particularly considered literature as art, but at the same time, it could be studied uh, from a scientific perspective. As a movement in literary studies, as a school of textual analysis, formalism emerged in Russia and Poland during 1910s. The Moscow Linguistic Circle is important because their formalist school emerged. Roman Jacobson, Grigory Vinokur, and Petr Bogatriev developed a system of literary analysis, which today we call formalism. So, what are the formal properties of a text? So, in other words, what makes up a text, or as formalists or new critics, what aspects of a literary text do we look at? Now, formal properties of a literary work include words, especially forms of the words in relation to their meanings. That is to say, the morphology of the words, and shape and structure of the text. Does the text include paragraphs, longer sentences, chunks, bits and pieces, or are there some disruptions in the text? That is to say, does the author stop at a certain point and move under the text, move under the line, and write a little bit more and then jump to another line? And harmony of the words, the prosodic structure of the text, that is to say, the prosody. How does the text sound? Are there likable sounds? Are there harsh sounds? And so on. The rhythm of the sentences or the rhythm in the poem. Does the text, let's say a poem or a novel, include a certain rhythm? Does it go like da 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 da, or da 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 da? And rhyming of the words. Does it please you as you read it? And meaning of the text as a whole in relation to these smaller segments. Well, when we say formal properties of a text, do we exclude anything? Yes, we do. Now, the following are not parts of what we consider formal properties of a text. Therefore, we do not look at them, we do not scrutinize them as we study a literary text. Among which the most important one is time of the work. The qualities of the period in which the text was written is not a matter of discussion, according to formalists and new critics. So let's say the qualities of 19th century British poetry, railroads, economic growth, and the start of Victorian period, the machinery, the factories, the booming economy, child labor. No, we do not look at them. We do not consider, we do not discuss them when we study a literary text. And background of the work, let's say, how does the text come into being? Who wrote it? How he or she wrote it? The childhood problems of the author, whether or not the author was alcoholic, these are not important. representation of the work, the symbolism of the words, author's moral, religious, or political values, and author's personal life. These are not within our concern. We do not care about these when we analyze a poem from a Russian formalist or new critical perspective. So in this table, you see what is relevant and what's not when we study formal properties of a text, that is to say, from a formalist perspective. So if you study the words, meaning of the words, the shapes of the words, morphology of the words, etymology of the words, structure of the text, harmony of the words, rhythm and rhymes, and meaning of the text in relation to all of them as a whole, then you are doing formalist criticism. But if you focus on time of the work, background of the work, representation of the work, symbolism of the words, or symbolism resting in the text itself, or particularities of the author's life and his or her values and so on, then you are not doing formalist literary criticism or new criticism. Now, it's time for a quiz. Which of the following is not used by a formalist critic during the analysis of the text? A. Word arts in the work. B. Images in the work. C. Harmony of the words. D. Symbolism of the words. E. Author's values. So, think carefully. Which of the following is not an action that a formalist critic would not perform during his or her analysis? Most probably you are right. A formalist critic would never consider using external resources such as author's life or the period's effect on his or her work. So the correct answer is E. So when a formalist critic critiques a painting from a formalist perspective, he or she would utter something like this. I quote, "Remember that a picture, before it's a picture of a battle horse, a nude woman, or some story, is essentially a flat surface covered in colors arranged in a certain order." Unquote. So in painting, a formalist critic would focus exclusively on the qualities of color, brushwork or brush strokes, form, lines, and overall the composition. Now, what about criticizing a literary work? In that sense, in literary studies, a formalist critic would focus exclusively on the words. So what can we say about the process of formalist analysis? So what are the steps we take while analyzing a literary text from a formalist perspective? So the first thing we do as a formalist critic is intensive reading. Intensive reading begins with a sensitivity to the words of the text and all their denotative and connotative values and the overall implications of each and all of the words. So in that sense, we look at multiple meanings of the words that make up a text. So after we master the individual words through dictionary studies, of course, by looking at etymologies of the words, connotative and denotative meanings of the words. We look at the structures and patterns because words, when they get together, form certain patterns at best. In that sense, a formalist critic would argue that a system in a literary text must be orderly, must be profound, must be original, so that you call it an artwork. So when we look at structures and patterns, we look at the interrelationships of the words. These relationships, these interrelationships are, of course, verbal relationships. These internal relationships gradually reveal the form. That is to say, these patterns, these segments, these small particularities of a text created through words reveal the form, bring us to the observation or understanding or articulating the form. So every writer in that sense, as I might quote from Hart Crane, creates a logic of metaphor. That is to say, the artwork resting in a literary text is based on a logic, so that this logic leads the words to be systematic. So in that sense, we look at, as a formalist critic, we look at the internal logic that governs the text. That is to say, our aim is to identify the overall form of the work. The context in that sense, that is to say, the nature and personality of the speaker, or along with word arts and so on, the nature and personality of the speaker, how the characters are talked about, written about, what they say, what they do, what they wear, and so on. These bring us all these particularities that at the end shows us to what extent this text has a logic, has a system in itself and by itself. A literary text can be approached and studied or analyzed from many different perspectives, of course, but when formalist and new critical perspective are considered, there are some certain questions that researchers or critics ask while studying a text from a formalist new critical perspective. And these questions focus on imagery, or the organic unity, or the interconnectedness of all the parts, characterization, plot structure, word arts, and also the atmosphere, mood, tone, etc. And again, word arts such as paradox, irony, ambiguity, and tension. How are these created? How are these brought together to create effect in a literary text? And also the style of the text by and large, and the aesthetic quality of the work, and the contradictions resting in the text, and the content and the segments of the text, and whether or not there appears to be a central or a focal passage that sums up the entirety of the work, that shows the core of the logic, that systematic existence of the text, and of course sound properties, rhythms, rhyme schemes, and so on in relation to the overall effect of the text. Although they are very similar and they are based on the same principles, new criticism focused on the two fallacies. And new critics argued that two fallacies were against understanding a literary text from an artistic as well as a scientific perspective. One of these fallacies was intentional fallacy. Now, intentional fallacy could be explained briefly as follows. So, oftentimes we try to understand, evaluate, or judge a literary work or an artwork by assuming that, by thinking that the artist or the writer or the poet who created artwork or a literary text had an intent, had a purpose, had a specific agenda while creating it. That is to say, I create a sculpture, or I paint, or I write a poem in order to give a certain message, or in order to give a particular effect and nothing else. Now, this was found to be um, irrelevant and at times unnecessary in the study of literature. And new critics argued that we cannot know the intent or purpose or the agenda of the author, and we cannot locate because many hidden uh, psychological, personal, artistic, literary, scientific, personal um, ideas or realities or experiences or even agendas come into play when an artist starts creating a work. Another problem was affective fallacy, which refers to the error of judging or evaluating a text on the basis of its emotional effects on a reader. Um, that is to say, just by looking at a painting or just by reading a poem, you might say that this gave me this artwork, this literary work gave me this particular emotional effect, and that's it. In contrast, new critics argued that um, a variety of emotions, a variety of experiences are already inherent in a literary text or in an artwork. So you cannot easily assume that there is one singular effect within one particular text. Three important keywords are extensively used by formalist and new critics. These are literariness, devices, and defamiliarization. Literariness is a body of features that distinguish literary work from other texts. This is done oftentimes through two major ways. One, the devices used by the author, and a specific technique called defamiliarization. Now, devices are the literary um, um, word arts used in literary works to enhance the writing. For instance, using lengthy sentences or use of metaphors, similes, and so on. And by using these word arts or stylistic qualities, such as using long sentences or brevity, terseness, the short sentences or short exclamations, these change uh, the, um, the the overall quality of writing by pulling it from the everyday language to literary language. But the most important feature employed by writers that gained the respect of formalist critics is the use of defamiliarization. In Russian, defamiliarization is called ostranenie, but defamiliarization is, well, it sounds like a very difficult concept, but it is not, because it's a long term. Making the familiar unfamiliar. For instance, a caning is a good example to this. You know, in a caning, the king is often called ring giver. So rather than saying this decision belongs to the king, you say this decision belongs to the ring giver. So in that sense, defamiliarization is the body of features that distinguish literary language from ordinary language. In that sense, for the formalist critic, a good, acceptable literary text must transform daily language and turn it into a literary one by the use of devices and techniques such as defamiliarization and symbols and metaphors in a literary text. When Russian formalists started work, there were three major trends of criticism in Russia. Although they were interchangeable, sometimes critics used all of them together. One trend was the biographical approach, which interpreted a text in terms of its author's life. So according to this biographical approach, the text is a summary of, or is an example to the author's own life experiences. The second one was the socio-historical one, which reduced the work to a mere mirror of ideas current at the time of its origin. That is to say, whatever you see in the text is what you see in society. And the third approach was the philosophical one, which used literature as an illustration of the interpreter's philosophical system. That is to say, the commentator or the interpreter or the critic would study the text from his or her own philosophical position to understand the place of morality in the text, or the issues related with, let's say, correctness or aesthetics and so on. So Russian formalists disregarded all these three approaches all at once and suggested that scientific study of a literary text had to disregard biographical, socio-historical, and philosophical approaches, and look at the text as a product of the author's own language capacity, in other words. So we have stated that Russian formalists argued against their current schools of criticism: biographical, socio-historical, and philosophical studies of literature. The formalists focused on the text through linguistics. For the formalists, linguistics was a science which borders on poetics and shares material with it. In that sense, let's say, if a biologist studies, let's say, fishes through microscopes or some other lab devices and so on,
the scientist who studies a literary text must use or had to use some certain materials. And the material came from linguistics. Those keywords, key terms, devices, and so on. For the formalist critic, the object of the science of literature was not literature. So scientific study of literature did not study literature, but literariness. That is to say, what makes literature literature. So in that sense, Russian formalists, by using linguistics as a branch, as a field of study, started a new period in the history of critical theory, because for the first time they posed this question: is what you do as a critic scientific? As I've mentioned before, defamiliarization, or in Russian, ostranenie, was a very important key term in the study of literature from a formalist perspective. In Art as Technique, Shklovsky introduces one of these central concepts of Russian formalism, and this one is defamiliarization, making the familiar unfamiliar. Now, defamiliarization works in a very simple manner. Take an ordinary sentence from ordinary language used every day by speakers like us on the street, at home, and so on, and transform this into an artistic one. Now, compare these two sentences. My daughter walked to school with her friends cheerfully. Now, we have the subject, verb, and object. So, the message is very clear, and it is not verbose. There are no words that are put there fancifully. And compare this with this one. It was a bunch of schoolmates, my daughter and her friends, walking cheerfully to school. Here you see that the construction of the sentence is not something that you use on a daily basis. So if we say it in Turkish, would you say kızım arkadaşlarıyla güle oynaya okula gitti? Or bir avuç okul arkadaşı, kızım ve arkadaşları okula güle oynaya gidiyorlardı. Okay? So in the second one, you see that doesn't sound like ordinary language. That doesn't sound like daily language. Therefore, well, we can discuss if it sounds artistic to you, if it is aesthetically appealing, but it is not from an ordinary use. Therefore, the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar to the reader, to make forms, grammar, the sound system difficult to perceive and comprehend. Such writing increases the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. So art's purpose is not to make us perceive meaning, but to create a specific perception of the object. I think you can easily connect this point to the aesthetic literary criticism, the work and the principles of the aesthetes. Obviously, For the formalists, poetry was a special form of speech, very different from daily language. Poetry has its own linguistic resources. And as a text, a literary text included various syntactical, lexical, and semantic features that separated poetry from ordinary language. Plot was also different from the story for the formalist critic. So, unlike previous authors or critics, the formalist critic argued that the plot was not synonymous with story. Story is something that almost all literary texts in certain genres share. There's a love affair, right? Star-crossed lovers as a motif, for instance, Romeo and Juliet. And this motif, star-crossed lovers, has the same story. A girl loves a boy and vice versa, but they cannot meet, they cannot get married or develop an affair because of their families who are against each other. This is the story. But the plot is different. How Shakespeare put this or took this story and transformed it, turned it into a different plot, shows that story and plot are two different things. Therefore, the more you transform the story, the successful your text become.
I hope you enjoyed the lesson. We are done with it, and now you are ready to complete your reading assignments. So far, we talked about formalist literary criticism, and also, although they were very similar in principle, we commented on the basic difference between new criticism and formalist literary criticism. Now it is time to apply what we have learned. So we will read a poem, study the poem from a formalist and new criticism perspective, and then discuss our findings. So I have chosen Carl Sandburg's Alice Corbin is Gone for us to read. I want you to read the poem and study the poem by focusing on what formalist and new criticism look for in a literary text, and then comment on your study by writing some entries in the discussion section. I want you to respond to at least one of your friends and read your classmates' ideas. As you listen to the poem, make sure that you understand and feel the harmony, the sound system that is given in the poem. Have a look at the words, try to do some dictionary work, do some etymological analysis, and then move forward towards understanding the structures, the patterns that create the poem as a system. So take notes very carefully by applying the knowledge you have gained so far. Carl Sandburg was a famous American poet, and I'm going to read Alice Corbin is Gone, one of his famous poems, to exemplify the sound system that is inherent in this poem. Alice Corbin is gone, and the Indians tell us where. She trusted the Indians, and they kept a trust in her.
She took a four-line Indian song and put it into English. You can sing it over and over and no harm done. The wind is carrying me round the sky. The wind is carrying me round the sky. My body is here in the valley. The wind is carrying me round the sky. Now it's time to have fun. You do not only study formalism and new criticism to apply these into your study of literature, but you can also use this knowledge to understand a film or an artwork such as a painting or a sculpture. You can even study a music piece, a song, a rap song, for instance, by employing your knowledge of formalism and new criticism. So I want you to, in the next slide, I want you to study the painting given from a formalist new critical perspective. Try to evaluate the parts in relation to the whole. Is there a system governing the components of the painting? What is this? What is the overarching message that is constructed by particular sounds, words, brush strokes, colors, shapes, and how each and all of them are brought together in this composition? Well, that is the end of the module. So far, in this module, you did a lot of reading, you studied some artwork, you analyzed a painting from a formalist perspective, you listened to your instructor giving some short lectures, and you read others' ideas about formalist criticism and new criticism. And you answered a lot of questions through quizzes given. And what else? You watched a video and you did a lot of thinking. So, congratulations. Good job.